The alien marketplace was alive with noise and color. Bright neon signs flickered in the air, advertising goods from across the galaxy. Strange creatures of all shapes and sizes moved through the crowded streets, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony. Among them walked a human woman, her presence unusual but not unwelcome. She moved with confidence, her eyes scanning the stalls for something specific. She stopped at a stall run by a tall, scaly alien with glowing yellow eyes. The alien merchant hissed as she picked up a small, glowing orb, examining it closely. "How much for this?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The alien sneered, revealing sharp teeth. "For you? Double the price. Humans don't belong here." The woman didn't flinch. She placed the orb back on the table and met the alien's gaze. "I'm not here to argue. Name a fair price, and we'll do business." The alien laughed, a harsh, grating sound that drew the attention of nearby shoppers. "Fair price? You humans are weak. You don't deserve fairness." The crowd began to gather, murmuring among themselves. The woman's expression remained steady, but her eyes hardened. "I'll ask one more time. Name a fair price." The alien leaned in, his face inches from hers. "Or what? What will you do, human? Cry? Run back to your pathetic planet?" Before she could respond, the alien's fist shot out, striking her across the face. The force of the blow sent her stumbling backward, and she fell to the ground. The crowd gasped, some stepping back in shock, others whispering nervously. The alien stood over her, his chest puffed out with pride. "That's what happens when you disrespect me," he growled. "Now get out of my sight." But the woman didn't cry. She didn't run. Instead, she slowly got to her feet, wiping a trickle of blood from the corner of her mouth. Her eyes locked onto the alien's, and for the first time, he saw something that made him pause. A cold, knowing smile spread across her face. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly. The alien frowned, his confidence wavering. "What are you talking about? You're nothing. Just another weak human." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Someone in the back whispered, "Does he even know who her husband is?" The words reached the alien's ears, and his smug expression faltered. He glanced around, noticing the nervous looks on the faces of the crowd. "What are you all whispering about?" he demanded. "Who is her husband?" No one answered. The woman's smile widened, and she turned to walk away, leaving the alien standing there, confused and uneasy. As she disappeared into the crowd, the whispers continued. "He's made a big mistake," someone said. "Her husband isn't just anyone. He's the one they call the Silent Storm." The alien's eyes widened. The name meant nothing to him, but the fear in the crowd's voices was unmistakable. He tried to shake off the feeling, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. Little did he know, his life was about to change forever. The sun was setting over a quiet suburban neighborhood on Earth. The streets were empty, save for the occasional chirping of birds and the distant hum of a passing car. In a small, unassuming house at the end of a cul-de-sac, a man sat on the porch, sipping a cup of tea. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a calm demeanor. His face was weathered, showing the marks of a life lived hard, but his eyes were kind. This was the woman's husband. Inside the house, the woman was packing a suitcase. She moved with purpose, folding clothes and placing them neatly into the bag. Her face was calm, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. She paused for a moment, looking out the window at her husband. He was staring at the horizon, lost in thought. "Are you sure you don't want to come with me?" she called out, breaking the silence. The man turned to look at her, a small smile playing on his lips. "You know I can't," he said. "Someone has to keep an eye on things here." She sighed, walking out onto the porch and sitting down beside him. I don't like leaving you behind. It feels wrong. He reached out, taking her hand in his. You'll be fine. You're stronger than you think. And besides, it's just a business trip. You'll be back before you know it. She nodded, but the worry in her eyes didn't fade. I just have a bad feeling about this. Like something's going to go wrong. He squeezed her hand gently. Nothing's going to go wrong. And if it does, you know I'll be there. She smiled at that, leaning her head on his shoulder. I know you will. You always are. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The man's mind wandered, drifting back to a time he rarely spoke about. A time when he wasn't just a husband or a neighbor. A time when he was something else entirely. Years ago, the man had been a soldier. Not just any soldier, but one of the best. He had fought in wars across the galaxy, his name whispered in awe by allies and enemies alike. They called him the Silent Storm because of his ability to strike without warning, leaving chaos in his wake. He had been a legend, a hero. But that was a long time ago. After the last war, he had retired. He had seen too much, done too much. He wanted a quiet life, away from the violence and the bloodshed. He had found it here, in this small house, with the woman he loved. But even now, the past lingered, like a shadow he couldn't quite shake. The woman's voice brought him back to the present. Promise me you'll be careful, she said, her tone serious. He looked at her, his expression softening. I promise. But you're the one who needs to be careful. Don't take any risks, okay? She nodded, standing up and brushing off her pants. I won't. I'll be back before you know it. He stood as well, pulling her into a tight hug. I'll miss you, he whispered. I'll miss you too, she replied, her voice muffled against his chest. They stayed like that for a moment, neither wanting to let go. Finally, she pulled away, picking up her suitcase and heading for the car. He watched as she drove off, the taillights disappearing into the distance. As the sound of the engine faded, the man felt a pang of unease. He couldn't explain it, but something felt off. He shook his head, trying to push the feeling away. She would be fine. She had to be. Later that night, the man sat alone in the living room, staring at the fireplace. The flames danced and flickered, casting shadows on the walls. His mind wandered again, this time to the day he had met his wife. It had been during the war. She had been a medic, tending to the wounded on the front lines. He had been injured, his unit wiped out in an ambush. She had found him, bleeding and barely conscious, and had saved his life. From that moment on, they had been inseparable. She had seen the darkness in him, the pain and the guilt, and had helped him heal. She had given him a reason to keep going, to build a new life. And now, she was out there, alone, in a galaxy that could be cruel and unforgiving. The man clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He knew he couldn't protect her forever, but that didn't stop him from wanting to. He would do whatever it took to keep her safe, even if it meant facing the demons of his past. The next morning, the man received a message. It was from an old friend, someone he hadn't heard from in years. The message was short and to the point, she's in trouble. You need to come. The man's heart sank. He didn't need to ask who she was. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, his mind racing. He didn't know what he would find when he got there, but he knew one thing for certain, he would do whatever it took to bring her home. The alien sat in his lavish quarters, a smug grin on his face. His name was Kral, and he was one of the most feared beings in this part of the galaxy. His species, the Zorathians, were known for their strength and ruthlessness, and Kral was no exception. He had built his reputation on intimidation and violence, and he wore it like a badge of honor. The incident at the marketplace had only added to his legend. The humans were weak, he thought, and that woman had been no different. She had dared to challenge him, and he had put her in her place. The memory of her falling to the ground brought a satisfied chuckle to his lips. But as he sat there, basking in his own glory, a nagging thought crept into his mind. The whispers from the crowd. The way they had looked at him after the woman had walked away. And that name, the Silent Storm. What did it mean? Kral shook his head, dismissing the thought. It didn't matter. Humans were nothing. They were soft, fragile creatures who couldn't possibly pose a threat to someone like him. Still, the unease lingered. Later that day, Kral decided to visit the marketplace again. He wanted to remind everyone who was in charge. As he walked through the crowded streets, the aliens around him stepped aside, bowing their heads in respect, or fear. Kral enjoyed the attention, his chest puffing out with pride. He stopped at the same stall where the incident had occurred. The merchant, a nervous-looking Zorathian, greeted him with a shaky smile. "Welcome, Kral. How can I serve you today?" Kral ignored the question, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Where is the human woman?" he demanded. "The one from yesterday." The merchant hesitated, his eyes darting around nervously. She was taken to the medical facility. "But I heard she left this morning." Kral frowned. "Left? Where did she go?" The merchant shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know. But, there's something you should know. Her husband, he's not an ordinary human." Kral's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" The merchant leaned in, lowering his voice. "They call him the Silent Storm. He's a legend. A warrior. They say he ended the Zorathian human war single-handedly. If he's coming here." Kral interrupted with a loud laugh, cutting the merchant off. "Silent Storm? What kind of ridiculous name is that? Humans and their stories. They're all the same, weaklings trying to sound tough." The merchant didn't respond, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Kral noticed and sneered. "You're all fools. If this Silent Storm shows up, I'll crush him like the insect he is." With that, Kral turned and walked away, his confidence restored. But deep down, a small part of him wondered if he had made a mistake. Meanwhile, at the medical facility, the woman was preparing to leave. Her face was bruised, but her spirit was unbroken. The doctors had tried to convince her to stay longer, but she had refused. She had a message to deliver. As she stepped outside, she was met by a group of locals. They had heard about the incident and wanted to offer their support. One of them, a small, furry alien with large eyes, approached her cautiously. "Are you sure you're okay?" the alien asked, its voice trembling. "Kral is dangerous. He won't stop until he's proven his point." The woman smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "I'll be fine. But Kral, he doesn't know what he's dealing with." The alien tilted its head, confused. "What do you mean?" The woman's smile turned cold. "My husband is coming. And when he does, Kral will regret ever laying a hand on me." The locals exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared to question her further. They had heard the stories, and they knew better than to doubt her. Back in his quarters, Kral received a message. It was from one of his scouts, and it was short and to the point: "A ship has entered the planet's atmosphere. It's human." Kral's eyes lit up with excitement. "Finally," he muttered. "Let's see what this Silent Storm is made of." He grabbed his weapon, a massive energy blade, and headed for the landing zone. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by an uneasy silence. The locals had heard the rumors, and they were staying out of sight. As Kral approached the landing zone, he saw the ship. It was small and unassuming, but there was something about it that made him pause. The design was sleek, almost predatory, and it radiated a sense of power. The ship's ramp lowered, and a figure stepped out. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a calm but intense presence. He wore simple clothes, but his eyes were like steel, cold and unyielding. Crowl smirked, stepping forward. "So, you're the famous Silent Storm," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You don't look so tough." The man didn't respond. He simply stared at Crowl, his expression unreadable. The silence was unnerving, and Crowl felt a flicker of doubt. But he pushed it aside, raising his weapon. "You hit my wife," the man said finally, his voice low and steady. "Now, you'll answer for it." Crowl laughed, but it sounded forced. "Big words for a human. Let's see if you can back them up." The man took a step forward, and Crowl felt a chill run down his spine. For the first time in his life, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. The landing zone was silent, the air thick with tension. The husband stood at the base of his ship, his eyes locked on Crowl. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stood there, radiating a quiet power that made even the bravest onlookers take a step back. Crowl tightened his grip on his energy blade, trying to shake off the unease creeping into his mind. "Well," he barked, his voice louder than necessary. "Are you just going to stand there, or are you going to fight?" The husband didn't respond immediately. His gaze swept over the crowd, taking in the nervous faces of the locals. Finally, his eyes returned to Crowl. "You hit my wife," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You'll regret that." Crowl laughed, though it sounded hollow. "Regret? Me? You're the one who should be worried, human. Do you even know who you're dealing with?" The husband took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A bully who thinks he's untouchable. But you're wrong." Crowl's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Big words. Let's see if you can back them up." The husband didn't flinch. He simply stood there, his calm demeanor unnerving. The crowd watched in silence, their breaths held as they waited for the inevitable clash. As the tension grew, the husband's mind drifted back to his past. He rarely thought about those days, but now, the memories came flooding back. Years ago, during the Zorathian-Human War, he had been a soldier. Not just any soldier, but one of the best. His unit had been tasked with a near-impossible mission: infiltrate a Zorathian stronghold and disable their defenses. The mission had been a suicide run, but he had volunteered without hesitation. The night of the mission, he had moved like a shadow, slipping past guards and disabling traps with ease. When he reached the control room, he had been faced with a dozen armed Zorathians. They had laughed at him, thinking he was just another human fool. They had stopped laughing when he took them down, one by one, without making a sound. By the time the reinforcements arrived, it was too late. The stronghold had fallen, and the war had turned in humanity's favor. After that, they had called him the Silent Storm. The name had stuck, and so had the legend. But he had never wanted the fame. He had only wanted to protect his people. Back in the present, Crowl was growing impatient. "What's the matter, human? Too scared to fight?" The husband's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "This isn't about fear. It's about justice." Crowl snorted. "Justice? There's no justice here. Only strength. And I'm stronger than you." The husband took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "Strength isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about why you hit. And you have no reason." Crowl's patience snapped. With a roar, he charged, swinging his energy blade in a wide arc. The husband sidestepped the attack with ease, his movements fluid and precise. Crowl swung again, and again, but each strike missed by inches. The crowd watched in awe as the husband dodged every attack, his calm never wavering. Kral's frustration grew, his strikes becoming wilder and more desperate. Finally, he lunged forward, aiming a powerful blow at the husband's chest. This time, the husband didn't dodge. Instead, he caught Kral's wrist, stopping the blade inches from his body. The crowd gasped as the husband twisted Kral's arm, forcing him to drop the weapon. Kral stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock. How did you do that?" he stammered. The husband didn't answer. He simply picked up the energy blade and examined it for a moment before tossing it aside. "You're not used to losing, are you?" he said, his voice still calm. "But today, you will." Kral's shock turned to anger. "You think you've won? This isn't over." The husband shook his head. "It is over. You just don't realize it yet." As the two men faced off, the crowd began to murmur. They had heard the stories, but seeing the silent storm in action was something else entirely. He moved with a grace and precision that seemed almost supernatural, his every action calculated and deliberate. Kral, on the other hand, was clearly out of his depth. His arrogance had been replaced by desperation, and his confidence was crumbling with every passing second. He tried to attack again, but the husband easily deflected the blow, sending him stumbling to the ground. The husband stood over him, his expression unreadable. "You hit my wife," he said again, his voice low and steady. "Now, you'll answer for it." Kral looked up at him, his bravado gone. For the first time in his life, he felt true fear. What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice trembling. The husband didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the crowd. "Leave," he said simply. "This doesn't concern you." The locals didn't need to be told twice. They scattered, leaving the two men alone in the empty landing zone. Kral tried to stand, but the husband placed a foot on his chest, pinning him to the ground. "You made a mistake," the husband said, his voice cold. "And now, you'll pay for it." The landing zone was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the husband's ship in the background. Kral lay on the ground, pinned under the husband's foot, his chest heaving with a mix of fear and anger. He had never felt so powerless, and it infuriated him. "Get off me!" Kral snarled, thrashing against the husband's hold. But the husband didn't budge. His foot remained firmly planted, his expression calm but unyielding. "You had your chance to walk away," the husband said, his voice low and steady. "But you chose violence. Now, you'll face the consequences." Kral's eyes burned with hatred. "You think you've won? You're nothing but a human. I'll destroy you." The husband didn't respond. Instead, he stepped back, giving Kral enough space to stand. Kral scrambled to his feet, his pride wounded but his determination unshaken. He lunged at the husband, swinging a wild punch, but the husband sidestepped effortlessly, his movements smooth and precise. Kral stumbled forward, catching himself before he fell. He turned, his fists clenched, and charged again. This time, the husband didn't dodge. He caught Kral's fist midair, his grip like iron. Kral's eyes widened in shock as the husband twisted his arm, forcing him to his knees. "You rely too much on brute force," the husband said, his tone almost conversational. "But strength without strategy is useless." Kral growled, trying to break free, but the husband's hold was unbreakable. With a swift motion, the husband released him, sending him sprawling to the ground. As Kral struggled to his feet, the husband's mind drifted back to his training. He had learned long ago that battles weren't won with strength alone. They were won with patience, precision, and the ability to adapt. He had honed those skills over years of combat, and they had never failed him. Kral, on the other hand, was predictable. His attacks were fueled by anger and arrogance, leaving him open to counterattacks. The husband could see every move before Kral made it, and he used that to his advantage. Kral charged again, this time aiming a kick at the husband's side. The husband blocked it with his forearm, the impact barely registering. He countered with a quick jab to Kral's ribs, causing the alien to stagger back, clutching his side. "You're slow," the husband said, his voice calm. "And careless. That's why you'll lose." Kral's face twisted with rage. "Shut up," he roared, launching another attack. But the husband was ready. He ducked under Kral's swing and delivered a sharp blow to his stomach, followed by a sweeping kick that knocked him off his feet. Kral hit the ground hard, the air rushing out of his lungs. He lay there for a moment, gasping, before pushing himself up again. His movements were slower now, his confidence wavering. The husband watched him closely, his expression unreadable. He didn't enjoy this. He had never enjoyed fighting. But he knew it was necessary. Kral had crossed a line, and he needed to be stopped. "You don't have to do this," the husband said, his voice softer now. "You can still walk away." Kral laughed, though it was strained. "Walk away? And let you win? Never." He charged again, but this time, the husband didn't hold back. He met Kral head-on, his movements a blur of precision and power. He blocked Kral's attacks with ease, countering with strikes that were calculated and deliberate. Kral tried to keep up, but he was no match for the husband's skill. Every move he made was countered, every attack deflected. The husband was like a force of nature, unstoppable and unrelenting. Finally, the husband saw an opening. He feinted to the left, drawing Kral's attention, before delivering a powerful blow to his jaw. Kral's head snapped back, and he stumbled, dazed. The husband followed up with a series of rapid strikes, each one landing with precision. Kral fell to his knees, his body battered and bruised. He looked up at the husband, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and disbelief. How are you doing this?" he gasped. The husband stood over him, his breathing steady, his expression calm. "I told you," he said. "Strength isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about knowing when and where to hit." Kral's shoulders slumped, his defiance fading. For the first time, he realized the truth. He had underestimated the husband, and now, he was paying the price. The crowd, which had been watching from a distance, began to murmur. They had never seen anything like this. Kral, the feared Zorathian, had been brought to his knees by a human. It was a sight they would never forget. The husband turned to them, his gaze sweeping over the onlookers. "This is over," he said, his voice carrying across the landing zone. "Go back to your lives. There's nothing more to see here." The locals hesitated for a moment before slowly dispersing, leaving the husband and Kral alone once more. Kral looked up at the husband, his pride shattered. What are you going to do to me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The husband didn't answer immediately. He knelt down, his eyes meeting Kral's. "I'm not going to kill you," he said finally. "But you'll never forget this day. And if you ever lay a hand on my wife, or anyone else, again, I'll be back. And next time, I won't be so merciful." Kral nodded weakly, his defiance gone. He had been humiliated, but he knew he had been spared. The husband stood, turning away without another word. Kral sat on the ground, his body aching from the fight. His pride was shattered, his confidence gone. He had always believed himself invincible, but the husband had proven him wrong. And yet, as he watched the man walk away, a spark of defiance flickered in his eyes. "You think you've won," Kral muttered, his voice low but laced with venom. "But this isn't over." The husband stopped, turning to look at him. "What did you say?" Kral smirked, though it was strained. "You heard me. You may have beaten me, but you're still just one man. And I'm not alone." The husband's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Crowl leaned back, his smirk widening. You really think I'm just some random thug? I'm part of something bigger. Something you can't stop. The husband took a step closer, his expression hardening. Explain. Crowl hesitated, but the look in the husband's eyes made it clear he wasn't in a position to refuse. Fine, he said, his tone bitter. I'm part of the Zorathian vanguard. We've been watching you for years. Waiting for the right moment to strike. The husband's jaw tightened. The Zorathian vanguard? I thought they were disbanded after the war. Crowl laughed, though it was hollow. Disbanded? No. We went underground. And now, we're stronger than ever. You may have ended the war, but you didn't end us. The husband's mind raced. The Zorathian vanguard had been one of the most dangerous factions during the war. They were ruthless, cunning, and utterly devoted to their cause. If they were still active, it meant the galaxy was in more danger than anyone realized. What do they want? The husband asked, his voice calm but firm. Crowl's smirk returned. Revenge. Power. The same things we've always wanted. And now, thanks to you, we have the perfect excuse to take it. The husband's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Crowl leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. You humiliated me. A Zorathian. In front of everyone. Do you really think the Vanguard will let that slide? They'll come for you. And when they do, they'll destroy everything you care about. The husband's fists clenched, but he kept his composure. If they come, I'll be ready. Crowl laughed, though it was strained. You don't understand. This isn't just about you. It's about sending a message. To humans. To the galaxy. The Zorathian vanguard doesn't lose. And if they have to burn entire planets to prove it, they will. The husband's heart sank. He had hoped to leave his past behind, but now, it was clear that wasn't an option. The Zorathian vanguard was a threat that couldn't be ignored. And if they were as powerful as Crowl claimed, the consequences could be catastrophic. As the husband processed this new information, his mind drifted back to the war. He had faced the Zorathian vanguard before, and he knew what they were capable of. They were relentless, willing to do whatever it took to achieve their goals. And now, they were targeting him. But why? He had retired years ago, leaving the fighting to others. What could they possibly want from him now? The answer came to him in a flash. It wasn't just about him. It was about his reputation. The silent storm was a symbol, a reminder of humanity's resilience. If the Vanguard could destroy him, they could crush that symbol, demoralizing humanity and anyone who dared to oppose them. The husband's jaw tightened. He couldn't let that happen. He had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let the Vanguard undo everything he had worked for. Crowl watched him closely, a smug look on his face. Starting to realize the gravity of the situation, aren't you? You may have beaten me, but you can't beat the Vanguard. No one can. The husband turned to him, his expression unreadable. You're wrong. The Vanguard may be powerful, but they're not invincible. And if they come for me, they'll regret it. Crowl's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. Big words. But words won't save you. Or your wife. The husband's eyes flashed with anger, but he kept his voice steady. If you or anyone else lays a finger on her, I'll make sure you regret it for the rest of your miserable life. Crowl didn't respond, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He had seen what the husband was capable of, and he knew the threat wasn't empty. The husband turned and walked away, his mind racing. He needed to warn his wife. He needed to prepare. The Zorathian Vanguard was a threat that couldn't be ignored, and he would do whatever it took to protect the people he loved. As he reached his ship, he paused, looking back at Crowl. "If you value your life, you'll stay out of my way," he said, his voice cold. "And if you ever come near my wife again, I won't be so merciful." Crowl didn't respond, but the message was clear. The husband wasn't just a man. He was a force to be reckoned with. And now, the Zorathian vanguard had made a dangerous enemy. The husband's ship soared through the stars, its engines humming steadily as it carried him back to Earth. His mind was racing, replaying the conversation with Crowl over and over. The Zorathian vanguard was still active, and they were coming for him. He had to warn his wife. He had to prepare. As the ship entered Earth's atmosphere, he activated the communication system. "This is the silent storm," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "I need to speak with my wife immediately." There was a brief pause before a familiar voice came through the speakers. "I'm here," his wife said, her tone tinged with concern. "What's wrong?" The husband took a deep breath. "We're in danger. The Zorathian vanguard is still active, and they're targeting us. I need you to gather supplies and meet me at the safe house. Do you remember where it is?" There was a moment of silence before she responded. "Yes, I remember. But, are you sure about this? I thought the vanguard was gone." "So did I," the husband replied. "But they're back, and they're more dangerous than ever. I'll explain everything when I see you. Just, be careful." "I will," she said. "You too." The communication ended, and the husband leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He had hoped to leave his past behind, but now, it was clear that wasn't an option. The Zorathian vanguard was a threat that couldn't be ignored, and he would do whatever it took to protect the people he loved. Meanwhile, on a distant planet, the Zorathian vanguard was preparing for war. Their leader, a tall, imposing figure known as Vrax, stood at the head of a massive war room, his eyes scanning the holographic displays that filled the space. "Crowl has failed us," Vrax said, his voice cold and commanding. "But his failure has given us an opportunity. The silent storm has revealed himself, and now, we can destroy him once and for all." The room was filled with Zorathian soldiers, their faces grim but determined. They had waited years for this moment, and they weren't about to let it slip away. "Our scouts have located his ship," one of the soldiers said, pointing to a holographic map. "He's heading back to Earth. If we move quickly, we can intercept him before he reaches the planet." Vrax nodded, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Good. Prepare the fleet. We strike at dawn." Back on Earth, the husband arrived at the safe house, a secluded cabin deep in the mountains. His wife was already there, her face pale with worry. She rushed to him as soon as he stepped inside, wrapping her arms around him. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm fine," he replied, holding her tightly. "But we're not safe here. The vanguard is coming, and they won't stop until they've destroyed us." She pulled back, looking up at him with wide eyes. "What are we going to do?" The husband took a deep breath, his mind racing. "We fight. But we can't do it alone. I need to call in some favors." He activated a hidden communication device, sending out a coded message to his old allies. It had been years since he had contacted them, but he knew they would come. They owed him that much. Hours later, the safe house was filled with familiar faces. Men and women who had fought alongside the husband during the war, their eyes filled with determination. They had all retired, just like him, but they knew the stakes. The Zorathian vanguard was a threat to everyone, not just the husband and his wife. "We've got your back," one of the allies said, a grizzled veteran with a scar running down his cheek. "But we're going to need a plan." The husband nodded, his expression grim. "The vanguard is coming, and they're not going to hold back. We need to be ready for anything." He spread out a map of the area, pointing to key locations. We'll set up defenses here, here, and here. They'll try to overwhelm us, but if we can hold them off long enough, we can turn the tide. The Allies nodded, their faces set with determination. They had faced impossible odds before, and they had come out on top. They could do it again. As night fell, the husband stood outside the safe house, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew the vanguard was coming, and he knew they wouldn't stop until they had destroyed him. But he wasn't going to let that happen. He had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let them win. His wife stepped out beside him, her hand slipping into his. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice steady. "Together." He squeezed her hand, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Together." In the distance, the first signs of the vanguard's fleet appeared on the horizon. The husband's allies took their positions, their weapons at the ready. The husband stood at the front, his eyes locked on the approaching ships. "This is it," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We hold the line. No matter what." The Allies nodded, their faces set with determination. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew they had something the vanguard didn't. They had each other. As the first wave of ships descended, the husband raised his weapon, his heart pounding in his chest. The battle was about to begin, and he was ready. Next part, the sky above the safe house was filled with the roar of engines as the Zorathian vanguard's fleet descended. The husband stood at the forefront, his allies flanking him, their weapons ready. The air was thick with tension, the calm before the storm. "Remember the plan," the husband said, his voice steady but firm. "Hold the line. No matter what." The Allies nodded, their faces set with determination. They had faced impossible odds before, and they weren't about to back down now. The first wave of Zorathian ships touched down, their doors sliding open to reveal rows of heavily armed soldiers. Vrax stepped out, his eyes scanning the area with a cold, calculating gaze. He spotted the husband and smirked. "So, this is where you've been hiding," Vrax said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I expected more from the legendary Silent Storm." The husband didn't respond. He simply raised his weapon, his eyes locked on Vrax. The message was clear, this wasn't a negotiation. It was a fight. The battle began with a deafening roar as both sides opened fire. The husband and his allies moved with precision, their years of training and experience evident in every move. They took cover behind makeshift barricades, returning fire with deadly accuracy. The husband's mind was sharp, his focus unwavering. He directed his allies with calm, decisive commands, his tactical brilliance shining through. "Flank them on the left," he shouted over the noise. "Push them back." The Allies obeyed without hesitation, their movements coordinated and efficient. They managed to hold the line, but the vanguard's forces were relentless. Wave after wave of soldiers poured out of the ships, their numbers seemingly endless. As the battle raged on, the husband's wife watched from the safe house, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to help, but she knew she would only be a distraction. Instead, she focused on supporting the Allies, providing them with supplies and medical aid when needed. At one point, an ally was hit, falling to the ground with a cry of pain. The husband's wife rushed to his side, dragging him to safety. "Stay with me," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You're going to be okay." The ally nodded weakly, his face pale but determined. "Thank you," he muttered before passing out. Back on the front lines, the husband was locked in a fierce duel with Vrax. The two men moved with deadly precision, their weapons clashing in a blur of motion. Vrax was strong, his strikes powerful and relentless, but the husband was faster, his movements fluid and calculated. "You're good," Vrax admitted, his voice strained. "But you can't win. Not against me." The husband didn't respond. He simply dodged another strike and countered with a swift blow to Vrax's side. The Zorathian leader staggered, his expression flickering with surprise. "You're wrong," the husband said, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about strength. It's about strategy. And you've already lost." Vrax's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, the husband delivered a powerful kick to his chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. Vrax tried to get up, but the husband was already on him, his weapon aimed at the Zorathian leader's head. "It's over," the husband said, his voice cold. "Surrender." Vrax laughed, though it was strained. "You think this is over? You're a fool. The vanguard will never stop. Not until you're dead." The husband's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a loud explosion rocked the battlefield. He turned to see one of the vanguard's ships engulfed in flames, its hull collapsing under the force of the blast. The Allies had managed to take out one of the ships, turning the tide of the battle. The vanguard's forces began to falter, their confidence shaken. The husband seized the opportunity, rallying his allies for a final push. "Now," he shouted. "Push them back." The Allies surged forward, their weapons blazing. The vanguard's forces, already disorganized, began to retreat, their morale crumbling under the relentless assault. Vrax, still on the ground, watched in disbelief as his forces were driven back. "No," he roared, his voice filled with rage. "This isn't possible." The husband turned to him, his expression unreadable. "It's over," he said again. "Your forces are retreating. Surrender, and I'll spare your life." Vrax's eyes burned with hatred, but he knew he was beaten. With a growl of frustration, he dropped his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. The battlefield fell silent as the last of the vanguard's forces retreated. The husband's allies cheered, their faces filled with relief and triumph. But the husband didn't celebrate. He simply stood there, his eyes scanning the area for any remaining threats. His wife ran to him, throwing her arms around him. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with awe. "You stopped them." The husband held her tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. "We did it," he corrected. "But this isn't over. The vanguard will be back. And when they are, we'll be ready." She nodded, her face set with determination. "We'll face them together." The husband smiled, a rare expression of warmth breaking through his stoic demeanor. Together. As the sun rose over the battlefield, the husband and his allies began the task of rebuilding and preparing for the next battle. They knew the fight was far from over, but they also knew they had something the vanguard didn't. They had each other. And that made all the difference. The aftermath of the battle was a scene of both destruction and hope. The safe house, though battered, still stood as a symbol of resilience. The husband and his allies worked tirelessly to tend to the wounded and secure the area, their movements fueled by a quiet determination. The Zorathian vanguard had been driven back, but everyone knew this wasn't the end. It was only a temporary victory. Vrax, now a prisoner, sat in a makeshift cell, his hands bound and his expression dark. The husband approached him, his face calm but unyielding. "You have a choice," he said, his voice steady. "You can continue this cycle of violence, or you can end it here. The choice is yours." Vrax glared at him, his pride wounded but his defiance intact. "You think you've won? This isn't over. The vanguard will never stop. We'll come back stronger, and next time, you won't be so lucky." The husband didn't flinch. "Maybe," he said. "But every time you come back, we'll be ready. And every time, you'll lose. Not because we're stronger, but because we fight for something greater than ourselves. We fight to protect what we love. You fight for power. And in the end, that's why you'll always fail." Vrax didn't respond, but the husband could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. As the days passed, the husband and his allies worked to fortify their defenses and prepare for the vanguard's inevitable return. But amidst the preparations, the husband found himself reflecting on the events that had brought them here. He had spent so much of his life fighting, first as a soldier and now as a protector. But what was it all for? What was the point of all this struggle? His wife found him one evening, sitting alone on the porch of the safe house, staring at the stars. She sat down beside him, her presence a comforting warmth. "What's on your mind?" she asked softly.